This is a Gogerty production. Cameraman, Kevin Gogerty. The idea, Kevin Gogerty. The photographer, Kevin Gogerty. The star is Irene Gogerty, and here she is. And we're ready to perform. This is all new.
Yes, brand new.
Brand new to both of us. But since I'm a lot older than Kevin, I have had a lot more experience talking, but not in this situation. Now, this is going to be kind of about me, but also about my family and my grandparents and where I came from and how I got here. I think that people who know me know that I talk a great deal about my family. And I am proud of the fact that my father and mother were young, and my father was a Norwegian immigrant. My mother was born in this country, but her parents were Norwegian immigrants. They had really hardships in their life. My mother's father, that would be my grandfather, died when he was rather a young man. His death was very, very tragic. It was the result of his being frostbitten so severely. He was a young man working for the railroad. He had a job called a section boss, which meant that a certain section of the railway that ran through his town was his responsibility. And this is the Great Northern Railroad that ran from Chicago to the West Coast. And through this little town of Grettinger, Iowa, is where they lived, and he was responsible. And on a terribly stormy, snowy, god-awful night, he had to go out with his crew and clear the tracks so that the railroads could get through, the trains could get through. And in so doing, he was badly frozen, frostbitten, which resulted in his death. Now, the fact of his death and his subsequent burial are kind of a mystery. My grandmother never talked about it. She refused to comment on it, even though we once in a while asked her. She referred to him as Mr. Reno, and we just didn't know, and nobody was curious enough to find out until much later we realized that we knew so little. Now, my grandmother was left widowed with 8 children, small children, that ranged in age from probably 21 down to 5. And how was she going to make a living? They did have a house, and they had a yard and a garden and all of that, and a cow, as they did in small towns. But how was she to make a living? Well, she became a midwife. She delivered babies and was considered every bit as good and capable as any doctor would be. And Grandma she not only delivered the baby, she cared for the family, she cared for the mother, and baked the bread and did the laundry and stayed usually 2 weeks with this family. Meanwhile, her children were left at home alone, but they had older sisters who cared for them. And when I have told this story to people, they say, well, what happened to the kids? Well, when you have a large family, your older children become the babysitters, and they do this automatically, and so that's what happened. Now, my father's parents lived in Norway and died in Norway. They never saw this country. But my grandfather was very keen on the United States and knew as much about American history as anybody who might have been, who lived in this country. And my dad didn't realize how well informed and well read his father was until he went to Norway in 1947 to visit his family, and his father just reeled off statistics and facts and stories about our presidents, our country, the wars. And my dad was so impressed. Then, skipping a number of years, we children all began to realize that our dad was just like that. He knew history, and he had a wealth of knowledge. And he became a citizen very early in after he arrived in this country. He immigrated when he was probably 22 and couldn't wait to become a citizen. So those are the ancestors that you Gogerty kids, that's your mother's two sets of relatives. Now, I was the second in a family of 6. I had a brother Norman, myself, I have a sister Margaret, a sister Doris, a sister Helen, and my youngest brother Eugene. And we lived on rented farms throughout the years. My dad was very skilled in many, many things, and my mother used to say, with a tinge of sarcasm, let's see, how did that say? Good at everything, but master of none. He could cut hair, he could stack straw, he could butcher. And in our various neighborhoods that we lived, when it became known that my dad was a butcher, when butchering time came, the neighbors would ask him to come and help. And he would, of course, he always was willing to help. And then in payment, they usually gave him the heart, the liver, and sometimes the head of an animal. Now, we didn't go for beef heads, but there was something to be said about a pork head, a big pig head. And I'm sure the brains were taken out, and probably the eyes. But this great big head was put in a boiler of water and boiled. I don't know how long. Now, my mother would have no part of this, but my dad believed that this was great eating. And the result of this junk was what they called head cheese. And it was H-E-A-D, head, cheese, C-H-E-E-S-E, like cheese. And believe it or not, it was quite tasty. Now, this is what he did. He'd scoop up this great big, yawning pig's head, scrape all the hair and skin, and then take the meat off the skull and off the bones and the cheeks and the chin of the hog. And I don't know what they did with the snout. I hope they threw it away. Now, this would be fine, real fine meat, tender and finely grained. This stuff was then cooked up separately. Spices were added. It was poured in a pan, and it would mold itself so that we had a big round circle of head cheese. And then it would be sliced and eaten like sandwich meat. Now, it sounds appalling, and while I'm talking to you and telling you this, and Kevin is sitting here almost ready to throw up, but this is what the pioneers lived on, and this is what my dad specialized in. But he was jack of all trades, that's the way that saying goes, and master of none, and was very well liked. Why not? Because he was willing to do anything. He could carpenter, he could do cement work, and then he farmed. And my mother, of course, kept house. She canned and she baked bread and she scrubbed floors and she washed windows and washed woodwork, and was a very, very busy lady. And saw to it that all of us went to high school and graduated. Now there was not much talk in those days about kids going to college. We had, and unfortunately, it was the Depression years, and there was so little money. So if you got through high school, you had an obligation to yourself and your parents is to get a job as fast as you could. I was fortunate because in my high school, I was able to take a normal training course that meant after I passed the examination in my local high school and went on to, then I could, and I had taken normal training courses in high school, which meant an extra history course and a course on methods, they called it, psychology and music. And then we were subjected to a state test. And if you passed a state test and you were 18 years old, you would get a certificate which permitted you to teach country school. And out of my class, I think there were about 14 normal training students. And I am very proud of the fact that I was the first one of the class to be hired as a rural school teacher. And I went to teach in the fall of 1931, and I absolutely loved teaching. I had a country school full of great kids, wonderful kids, who came from hardworking German farmers. And they were just terrific kids. And I had such good cooperation from the parents were great people also. So I had 3 years of absolutely wonderful, wonderful time with my teaching experience. And my salary, I started out making $65 a month. And by the time I finished my 3rd year, 2 things had happened. I met and married Irene Gogerty, and my salary was $40 a month. And I couldn't teach anymore. Married women were not hired. They were not hired because the feeling was that we were taking a job away from a girl who didn't have a husband. So that ended my teaching career. And it's kind of too bad because I happen to be one of those people, I believe, that is just a natural born teacher. I had great rapport with my kids, and my teaching abilities were good because my kids did so well and passed into high school and did all of that stuff. And I'm still friends with some of the kids that went to school with me. Now let's stop. With this?
No, perfect.
Now I'll drink my beer. Don't you put the camera on. Now, am I getting too wordy?
No, you're doing perfect. Perfect.
Okay.
No, I'm just sitting here, listening.
I can tell you're interested.
Yeah.
Your face mirrors what I'm saying, and that's great.
That's what I'm trying to grasp here. I'm gonna start taking some notes.
Yeah.
Oh, sure, I can see it.
And you need a place to plug that in?
No, battery operated.
Oh.
100% battery operated.
Well.
And I said, yeah, we're doing, great, good start off, good, content. You got plenty of content.
Yeah, I have, and I don't want to talk too. Oh, I'm fooled with this. I don't want to talk too fast or too slow.
No, you're doing great. Doing great. Color's great. That was my biggest thing. I don't have. I'm gonna get a bigger. I'm gonna get a light.
Mm-hmm.
So if I roll in the dark, I can.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that. Of course, we got these windows right here.
Yeah, that works perfect. I was, kind of concerned on how the lighting is gonna be.
Mm-hmm.
But.
Well, and of course, it's a good bright day today.
Yeah, and the color's great. If we we don't have to sit here the whole entire time. We can, you know, if you want to like move outside or go
Hmm.
into the kitchen.
Yeah, well, if I feel like I need to go to the bathroom or something, I'll go. I'll raise my finger, and then you turn off
Yeah.
the equipment.
Just tell me when.
Yeah, well, anytime now.
So you wanna, I'm gonna kind of take some notes where we're at. You ready to go?
Yeah. Now, I don't intend it to have too many narratives,
No.
but I think that one is particularly interesting.
That was yeah, that's real interesting. Real interesting. You kind of give another perspective to it. Anytime you're ready.
Okay. After that experience, and we got rid of our unwanted visitor, I was more uneasy in that house than I had ever been before. I just didn't feel comfortable. But it nothing like that happened again. But I had been suddenly made aware of what can happen when a woman is living all alone, because Hank had to be gone all day working. That winter was probably the worst winter that I has ever known. It would be the winter of 35 and then 36. Snow, cold, cold, snow, snow, cold. And we were just devastated with cold weather, and we were poor, had very little money. And then a break came along. Hank was offered a job in a little creamery in Zering. He knew nothing about creamery. He had never worked at anything like that. But the man who worked there, who was the creamery operator, was a Danish immigrant who was a skilled butter maker. So Hank went to work at $40 a week, and all the milk, cream, and butter that we could use was part of the pay. We rented a little house in Zering, and we were set once again. And the job was fine, and Hank was very happy with working. He particularly liked the creamery work because it was so clean. The work was clean, the environment was clean, and that is one of the reasons he was not cut out to be a farmer, because he hated the filth of the barnyard. He liked clean white overalls and a clean white shirt, and he liked an environment that was clean. And of course, in a creamery, it was essential that everything was immaculate. And he became a very skilled butter maker. Worked there for a couple of years, decided, with the help and the advice of a good friend, he ought to go to Ames, to the college, and become a better qualified creamery worker. So he enrolled in what they called creamery operation course. Took It was actually a 2-year course, but we were so poor and needed the money so badly that at the end of the first year, one of the instructors knew that we were just getting along with hardly any money, and he said he knew of a job that Hank could apply for. And by then we had 2 children, Shirley and Mary, and he went down to Rock Island, Illinois, put in an application, and was hired. So that changed everything for a little while. We moved to Rock Island, lived in an apartment, and it was okay. I didn't like apartment living because I was so conscientious that my little daughters were making too much noise for the other tenants. And so we couldn't wait to move out of there, which was a foolish thing to do in a way because we only paid $8 a week rent. And then we moved into a furnished house and they charged us $45 a month. And it just seemed like that was so foolish because then we had to pay our utilities and we had to pay the water bill. And so those were the little silly mistakes that people make. But we managed to get through that and found another house that we moved into over in Davenport. And the world's worst landlord was our landlord. But that's what you always say, you know. If you're the tenant, you hate your landlord. Usually, like you do sometimes if you hate your boss, because they got something over on you, I guess. But we made out okay, but we moved over to Davenport. And then the good Lord decided to bless us one more time, and Jim and John were born. 16th of January, big snowstorm, drove to the hospital in a Model A that choked and sputtered the whole darn way. But now I was the mother of twins. Our family galloped from 2 little girls to 4 children. John and Jim were 6 weeks premature, had to stay in the hospital in an incubator. I came home from the hospital at the end of 6 days and boo-hooed and carried on because I was just so... That was a terrible period of my life to have given birth to 2 darling little boys and had to leave them in the hospital. And emotionally, I was just not quite able to cope with that. However, you know, you just have to do things. You got to get yourself in hand. And I kind of boo-hooed around there, and Hank came home, and he had powers of observation that touched my heart to this day. He said, "You know what I think you need?" And I thought what he was going to say is, "You need a beating the way you carry on." And I said, "I don't know. I just wish that the little boys were home." And he said, "I'll tell you what. I'm going to give you enough money to so you can get your hair done." He said, "You need a perm. Why don't you get a perm? And then maybe end of this week, the babies are going to come home." So I went into Davenport, got my hair done, and I felt better right away. It just made a big difference. But the little boys had to stay in the incubator another couple weeks. But just getting my hair done, and Hank being sensitive enough to know that he had to get me out of the house. He had to get me away from the environment, and I got a nice perm, and I felt like a different person. And then the little boys, finally it came time for us to go and get them. And they were so tiny, and their skin, you know, they were premature, their skin was kind of flaky. And what I had to do was to melt snow and wash their clothes in melted snow because they would leave no residue of harshness on their little clothing. And the doctor recommended that I also bathe them in the melted snow water. And I did that for about 2 weeks, and I was just swamped with work. But I was so happy to have my little babies at home. And they were good little babies, too. They were just darling, and they were cute, and Shirley and Mary loved them, and I was most happy with them. Now we'll stop a while.
You want to move the clip up a little bit?
Okay. Is my voice fading out?
I don't, no, I just when you cross your arms.
Yeah, and I do that so much.
I know, so we'll keep it up a little higher.
Okay.
So when you do that, it'll cover it. So anytime.
Okay, now I am to where we've got some babies. I hope this is going to be interesting.
It will be.
Oh, I hope so. I hope it isn't boring and dull and dumb.
What we'll do is, once we get the the final,
Uh-huh.
you and I will watch the whole entire. When we get all done,
Uh-huh.
we'll
Then
take
we'll
a minute.
decide when to make corrections
Right.
and omissions.
We'll watch the raw tape and maybe get some photographs of and kind of bring a visual,
Mm-hmm.
pan in and out between the videotape and you talking, and maybe a photograph of Jim and John when they were babies,
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah, if I can find such. Yeah, I think I might be able to find some pictures of that. Now, let's see. I got Jim and John, their babies. Now they're home. Now, let me see. I have to see what. Oh, yeah. Now we got another. I have another chapter. And I'm ready whenever you are. Now, whenever you want to call it a day, Kevin.
No, you keep talking. I'll tell you. Yeah, I got plenty of time.
Well, okay. So I have to go think back now. I don't have a teleprompter, you see, so so.
Well, right now we're at Jim and John.
All right, Jim. Oh yes, that's right. Jim and John are born, and they are home from the hospital, and so they had been home. I had got my new perm, and they were home from the hospital, and I was so happy now. I had my little family intact. Several things happened all at once. Ned, Hank's brother from Zeering, unemployed, came down to our place on a Sunday, the very Sunday that Jim and John came home from the hospital, and said, "Is there a chance you could get me a job at that dairy?" He said, "I haven't got a job, and I'm tired of trying to do farm work." So Hank said, "Sure, you can get a job there, or you might find another job somewhere, but you can stay here while you're looking." And then he said, "What about Margaret and Richard?" Richard was his little son. And so I said, "Well, they can come down. We can make room. This is how you do in families. You figure out a way." But I thought, oh, our house is so small. How are we going to work this out? And just about that time, the problem was solved without a hitch. The landlord came over and knocked on the door and said, "How many people are living in this house?" And I said, "Well, there's Hank and I and my two little girls and my two baby boys." Well, he said, "My insurance doesn't cover that many people." He said, "This visit is a notice for you. You're going to have to move. You're going to have to get out in 2 weeks." And I stared at him and I said, "Why, this is terrible." I said, "I have these two little," he said, "I don't care how many little babies you have. You probably have a lot more, but you're not living in my house." He said, "My insurance doesn't cover this many people. It covers 5 people." And I thought, "Oh, you miserable old wretch." And so when Hank came home, and Ned was there, and Ned had looked for a job, and it looked like he was going to get a job right away. They said, "Not to worry, we'll find a house. I just know we can find a house to rent." And that's what happened. They found a big old house in Davenport, big old duplex. Margaret and Ned and Richard lived upstairs, and we lived down. We had the 2 little girls, 2 little boys, Hank and I, and we lived in the downstairs. It was a nice big old house. And we were very happy there, and I liked that old house. And it was modern, had a wonderful big basement, clotheslines down there if you needed to dry your clothes indoors. Running, of course it had running water, but because we didn't have that out to that other place that we lived. And with my little family, I certainly needed some conveniences. And Hank continued to work at the dairy. Ned got himself a job. Margaret, so that when Margaret and Richard came, I told Margaret if she wanted to get a job, for her to go ahead and find herself a job, and I would take care of Richard, her little boy. And he and Mary were the same age, and he was just a delightful little guy. So things worked out, and that's how it happened. Everything went quite smoothly. Then my sister Doris, living in Prairie Farm, Wisconsin, wrote me and said she thought she and a couple of her girlfriends. I may have to stop.
Okay. Kind of low. Your voice is good.
Yeah, my voice just gets kind of quivery. So we'll do a little more. I'll tell you, we'll do it till 3 o'clock,
Okay.
and then that'll be it.
Wonderful.
Well, I probably ought to run to the bathroom too.
Okay.
I wouldn't want that to show that I need to go to the bathroom. The camera picks up everything.
You're right.